Krishna Krishna Hari 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 Ram. Ram Ram Hari 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 Krishna Hari Ram Hari Ram. Ram Ram Hari 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 Krishna Hari Krishna Krishna Hari 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 Ram Hari Ram. Ram Ram Hari 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 Krishna Hari Krishna Krishna Hari 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 Ram. Yes. Ram Ram Hari 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 Krishna Hari Krishna Krishna. Yeah. Hari 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 Ram Hari Ram. Ram Ram Hari 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 Krishna Hari Krishna Krishna Hari 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 Ram Hari Ram. Ram Hari 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 Krishna Hari Krishna Krishna Hari 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 Ram Hari Ram. Ram Ram Hari 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 Krishna Hari Ram Ram Hari Hari. Okay, devotees. Hari Bol. Let's read from Prabhupada-lilamrita, and we'll see about making a few comments as we go. All right, let's have a look now. Where? Wait a minute. Wrong book. Where were we? On the Bowery. Still on the Bowery, I think.
I wasn't here for the last Times class.
Oh, you weren't?
Friday night here at Times, I was sitting in front still.
Oh, wow.
I'm going to your name, I'll just, yeah.
Well, yeah. Or sometimes shouting, yeah?
Yeah, there was sometimes shouting there.
Okay, then it's the next paragraph.
The last word was everything is gone.
That's right, yeah, okay. Okay, so there you go, devotees. We're in the second volume. I forget which chapter, but here we are. Which chapter? No, I don't know. Anyway, some chapter. What was it? Yeah, but the chapter was on the Bowery, I think. So, yeah, right. Nama Om Vishnupadaya Krishna Prestaya Bhutale Shrimati Bhaktivedanta Swaminiti Namane Namaste Saraswati Deve Gauravani Pracharane Nirvishesha Shunyavadi Paschatyadesh Tarne Sri Krishna Chaitanya Pramanityananda Shri Advaita Gadadha Shivasani Gaura Bhaktivinoda Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare Hare Vanchkalpatarubhyascha Kripa Sindhubhyevacha Patidanam Pavanebhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namaha. Okay, so here we are. And to begin with, Mike Grant is talking about his experience with Prabhupada in the beginning. And Mike Grant, in due course, became Mukunda Das. Mike Grant, I went up to him afterward. I had the same feeling I'd had on other occasions when I'd been to hear famous people in concerts. I was always interested in going by after concerts to see musicians and singers just to meet them and see what they were like. I had a similar feeling after Swamiji spoke, so I went up and started talking. But the experience was different from the others in that he wasn't in a hurry. He could talk to me, whereas with others all you could do was get in a few words. They were always more interested in something else. But he was a person who was actually showing some interest in me as a person. And I was so overwhelmed that I ran out of things to say very quickly. I was surprised. Our meeting broke off on the basis of my not having anything further to say. It was just the opposite of so many other experiences where some performer would be hurrying off to do something else. This time, I was the one who couldn't continue." Unquote. Prabhupada liked to take walks. From his doorstep at 94 Bowery, he could see directly across the street the Fulton Hotel, a 5-story flop house. Surrounding him were other lower Manhattan lodging houses, whose tenants wandered the sidewalks from early morning till dark. An occasional flock of pigeons would stir and fly from one rooftop to the next or descend to the street. Traffic was heavy. The Bowery was part of a truck route to and from Brooklyn by way of the Brooklyn and Manhattan bridges. The Bowery sloped gently downhill toward the north, and Prabhupada could see signboards, a few scraggly Manhattan trees, and the street lights and traffic signals as far up as 4th Street. He could see Con Edison with its prominent clock tower, and, if there were no clouds, the top of the Empire State Building on 34th Street. He would walk alone in the morning through the Bowery neighborhood. The month of May that year saw more frequent rains than was normal, and Prabhupada carried an umbrella. Sometimes he walked in the rain, but he was not always alone. Sometimes he walked with one of his new friends and talked. Sometimes he shopped. Bitter melon, dal, hing, chickpea flour, and other specialty foods common in Indian vegetarian cuisine were available in Chinatown's nearby markets. On leaving the loft, he would walk south a few steps to the corner of Bowery and Hester Street. Turning right on Hester, he would immediately be in Chinatown, where the shops, markets, and even the Manhattan Savings Bank were identified by signs lettered in Chinese. Sometimes he would walk 1 block further south to Canal Street, with its Central Asian food market and many other street-side fruit and vegetable markets. In the early morning, the sidewalks were almost deserted, but as the shops began to open for business, the streets became crowded with local workers, shopkeepers, tourists, and aimless derelicts. The winding side streets of Chinatown were lined with hundreds of small stores, and parked cars lined both sides of the street. His walks on Hester would sometimes take him into Little Italy, which overlaps Chinatown at Mulberry Street. In this neighborhood, places like Chinese pork products and the Mi Jung Mi supermarket stood alongside Umberto's Clam House and the Puglia restaurant, advertising cappuccino alla Puglia, coffee from Puglia. His walks west of Bari into Chinatown and Little Italy were mainly for shopping, but he also noted prospective sites for a temple. Chatham Tower on Chatham Square particularly drew his attention. Sometimes he would walk in the opposite direction as far as the East River and Brooklyn Bridge. But when a friend warned him that a sniper had been firing at strollers along the river, he stopped going there. Despite the bad neighborhood where Prabhupada lived and walked, he was rarely disturbed. Often he would find several Bowery bums asleep or unconscious at his door, and he would have to step over them. Sometimes a drunk, simply out of his inability to maneuver, would bump into him, or a derelict would mutter something unintelligible or laugh at him. The more sober ones would stand and gesture courteously, ushering the Swami into or out of his door at 94 Bowery. He would pass among them, acknowledging their good manners as they cleared his path. Certainly few of the Bowery men and others who saw him on his walks knew much about the small, elderly Indian sadhu dressed in saffron and carrying an umbrella and a brown grocery sack. Sometimes Prabhupada would meet one of his new friends on the street. Jan, Michael Grant's girlfriend, met him on several occasions as he was out walking. She became, I forget, but she was initiated, but she left early. Jan, I would see him in the midst of this potpourri of people down there, walking down the street. He always had an umbrella, and he would always have such a serene look on his face. He would just be taking his afternoon jaunts, walking along, sometimes stepping over the drunks. And I would always get sort of nervous when I would meet him on the sidewalk. He would say, "Are you chanting?" And I would say, "Sometimes." And then he would say, "That's a good girl," unquote. Sitting cross-legged, his back to the shelf, with its assortment of potted plants, a whitish chadar wrapped in wide, loose folds across his body, Prabhupada looked grave, almost sorrowful. Oh yeah, her name, Jan, became Janaki. She was the wife of Mukunda. As a 76, of course. But when I met Mukunda, which was end of 73, they'd already separated some time, although he was still wearing white. The picture and an accompanying article appeared in a June issue of the Village Voice. The article read, quote, "The meeting of the mystical West and practical East comes alive in the curious contrast between A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami and his American disciples. The Swami, a cultivated man of 70 with a distinguished education, is here for a year to preach his gospel of peace, goodwill, nearness to God, and, more practically, to raise money for his American church. Like his teachings, the Swami is sensible and direct. His main teaching is that mankind may come closer to God by reciting his holy name. Despite the fact that the Swami came to America to seek out the root of godless materialism, a disease, he said, that has already enveloped India, he is a realistic man. If there's any place on earth with money to build a temple, it is here. The Swami wishes to found in America an international society for Krishna consciousness, which will be open for anyone, including women," unquote. The article had been written by Howard Smith. He had first heard of the Swami by a phone call from a contact who had told him of an interesting holy man from India living in a loft in the Bowery. "Go there any time," Howard's contact had told him. "He's always there. I think you'll find it fascinating. I believe he's about to start a major religious movement." Howard Smith. So I went down there and went upstairs into this very funky artist's loft. There were carpets all over the place, old and worn out, and a lot of people sitting around in various kinds of hippie garb, plus what I think they must have thought was Indian garb. Most of them were sitting alone around the room, facing the wall, like they had nothing to do with each other. They were sitting cross-legged, and each one seemed to be doing something different. Nobody paid any attention to me when I walked in. I saw shoes lined up, and I thought, maybe I'm supposed to take off my shoes. But nobody said anything to me. So I walked around the edge of the carpet, looking for somebody to pay attention to me. I wondered what was going on, and I didn't want to interrupt anybody because they all seemed deep into whatever kind of prayers they were doing. In the back of the loft, I noticed a little curtain, an Indian madras type of curtain, and so I decided I'd peer into that area. I looked in, and there was Swami Bhaktivedanta sitting there cross-legged in saffron garments, with the markings on his forehead and nose, and his hand in the bead bag. Even though he looked like the real thing, he seemed more approachable, and I said, "Hello," and he looked up. I said, "Swami Bhaktivedanta," and he said, "Yes." I said, "I'm Howard Smith." I was expecting to sit down, so I said, "Excuse me, I have to take off my shoes." And he said, "Why do you want to take off your shoes?" I said, "I don't know. I saw all the shoes out there." And he said, "I didn't ask you to take your shoes off." I said, "What are all those people out there doing?" And he said, "I don't know." Wow, what's going on? And they don't know what they're doing. I'm trying to teach them, and they seem to be misunderstanding me. They're very confused people. Then we sat and talked, and I liked him a lot right away. I mean, I'd met a lot of other swamis, and I didn't like them too much. And I don't think it's fair to lump them all together and say, those swamis in India. Because he was very, very basic, and that's what I seemed to like about him. He not only made me feel at ease, but he seemed very open and honest, like he asked my advice on things. He was very new in the country. I thought his ideas stood a good chance of taking hold because he seemed so practical. His head didn't seem in the clouds. He wasn't talking mysticism every third word. I guess that is where his soul was at, but that isn't where his normal conversational consciousness was at. Then he said several people had told him that the voice would be a very good place to be written up, and that basically it would reach the kind of people who already perhaps had a leaning or interest in what he was preaching. And I said that I thought he was correct. He asked me if I had read any books or knew anything about Indian culture? And I said, no, I didn't really. We talked a little, and he explained to me that he had these books in English that he'd already translated in India. And he handed those to me and said, if you want more background, you can read these. It was obvious to me that I was not talking to some fellow who had just decided that he had seen God and was going to tell people about it. He seemed to be an educated man, much more than myself actually, and I liked his humbleness. I just plain liked the guy. He explained everything. I wanted to know everything I wanted to know. The significance of what he was wearing, the mark in his forehead, the bead bag, and I liked all his explanations. Everything was very practical. Then he talked about temples all over the world, and he said, well, we've got a long way to go, but I'm very patient, unquote. Prabhupada had hope for what the Voice article had referred to as, quote unquote, his American church. There was life in his lectures and kirtans, and at least he was acquiring a small, regular following. But from India, there was no hope. He had continued corresponding with Sumati Maharaji, his godbrothers, and the Indian central government, but their replies had not been encouraging. In the faith that Padampat Singhania would agree to his plans for a Krishna temple in Manhattan and finance its construction, Prabhupada had petitioned New Delhi to sanction the release of foreign exchange. He had written to the Reserve Bank of India, New Delhi, quote, I want to establish this cultural center, and for this, I wish to get some exchange from India. I think there are good prospects all over the world for propagating the culture of how to love God in these days of forgetfulness, unquote. A month later, the Indian bank had advised him to resubmit his request through the Indian embassy in Washington to the finance minister of the Indian central government. Prabhupada had complied, and another month had passed with no word from the government. One of his godbrothers had written that Swamiji should come back to India and work personally to get the government sanction. But Prabhupada didn't want to leave America now. He wrote to Sumati Maharaji, quote, I'm trying to avoid the journey to India and again coming back, especially for the reason that I'm holding at the above address classes thrice a week and training some American youth in the matter of Sankirtan and devotional service to the Lord. Some of them are taking the lessons very sincerely, and in the future they may be very good Vaishnavas according to the rigid standards, unquote. One day, a curious, unsolicited correspondent wrote to Prabhupada from India. His name was Mukti Brahmachari. Introducing himself as a disciple of one of Prabhupada's godbrothers and reminding Prabhupada of their past slight acquaintance, Mukti wrote of his eagerness to join Prabhupada in America. Certainly Prabhupada still had hopes for getting assistance from his godbrothers in India, quote unquote, This mission is not simply one man's work, unquote. Therefore, he invited Mukti to come to America and asked him to request his guru to cooperate by working personally to secure government sanction for the release of foreign exchange. Mukti wrote back, reaffirming his eagerness, but expressing doubt that his spiritual master would give him permission. Mukti thought he should first come to the United States and then request his spiritual master's help. Oh, Krishna, this is not how to relate with the spiritual master. Ah, Krishna, really? Yes, it's not the way to deal with the spiritual master. Oh dear. Mukti thought, Prabhupada was annoyed and he sent an immediate reply. Yes. Because it's nonsense, really. So Prabhupada replied, is preaching in America my private business? Srila Prabhupada Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati wanted to construct some temples in foreign countries as preaching centers of the message of Srila Rupa Raghunath, and I'm trying to do this in this part of the world. The money is ready and the opportunity is open. If, by seeing the finance minister, this work can be facilitated, why should we wait because you cannot talk with your Guru Maharaj about cooperation because you're afraid your journey will be cancelled? Please do not think in that way. Take everything as Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Prabhupada's work and try to do the needful. Do not think for a moment that my interest is different from that of your Guru Maharaj. We're executing the will of Srila Prabhupada according to our own capacity. A combined effort would have been far better. Unquote. Mukti submitted the entire proposal before his spiritual master, who, as Mukti predicted, cancelled the trip. Although Mukti's guru was Srila Prabhupada's godbrother, he did not want to be involved, and he doubted that Prabhupada would actually get a donation from Padampat Singhania. And now Mukti Brahmachari also doubted. If your program is not bona fide, the approach to a big personality will be a ludicrous one, no doubt. Unquote. On the same day that Prabhupada received the ludicrous letter, he also received the final blow of non-cooperation from the Indian government. Second Secretary Prakash Shah of the Indian Embassy in Washington, D.C. wrote, quote, due to existing conditions of foreign exchange stringency, it is not possible for the government of India to accede to your request for relief of foreign exchange. You may perhaps like to raise funds from residents in America. What rascals, what rascals. It's terrible. Unquote. It was confirmed. Prabhupada would have to work without outside help. He would continue alone in New York City. His last letter to Mukti Brahmachari reveals his deep faith and determination. Quote, so the controversy is now closed, and there's no need of help from anyone else. We're not always successful in our attempts at preaching work, But such failures are certainly not ludicrous. In the absolute field, both success and failure are glorious. Even Lord Nityananda pretended to be a failure at converting Jagai and Madai in the first attempt. Rather, he was personally injured in such an attempt. But that was certainly not ludicrous. The whole thing was transcendental, and it was glorious for all parties concerned, unquote. If Krishna consciousness were ever to take hold in America, it would have to be without assistance from the Indian government or Indian financiers. Not even a lone Indian brahmachari would join him. Krishna was revealing his plan to Prabhupada in a different way. With the Singhania sanctioned schemes finished and behind him, Prabhupada would turn all his energy toward the young men and women coming to him in his Bowery loft. He wrote to Sumati Maharaji, quote, "I'm now trying to incorporate one corporation of the local friends and admirers under the name International Society for Krishna Consciousness Incorporated," unquote. Of all his friends and admirers, Prabhupada gave his roommate, David Allen, the most personal attention and training. He felt he was giving David a special chance to become America's first genuine Vaishnav. Prabhupada would eventually return to India, and he wanted to take David to Vrindavan. He would show him temple worship and train him for future preaching in the West. He had requested Sumati Maharaji to provide free passage for David as well as for himself. Quote, "You will be pleased to see this American boy. He's coming of a good family and is a sincere soul to this line of culture. There are others also in the class I'm holding here, but I wish to take with me only one of them." So now Prabhupada's speaking. "I'm very glad to say," Prabhupada said one evening in his lecture, "that our Mr. David says sometimes, 'Swamiji, I want to increase my spiritual life immediately.'" Prabhupada laughed as he imitated David's urgency. Take patience, I tell him. It will be done, of course. When you've got such desire, God will help you. He's within you. He's simply trying to see how sincere you are. Then he will give you all opportunities to increase your spiritual life, unquote. At first, David and the Swami lived together peacefully in the large hall, the Swami working concentratedly on his side of the partition, David ranging throughout the large open space. David, however, continued taking marijuana, LSD, and amphetamines, and Prabhupada had no choice but to tolerate it. Several times he told David that drugs and hallucinations would not help his spiritual life, but David would look distracted. He was becoming estranged from the Swami. But Prabhupada had a plan to use the loft as a temple, to transform it into New York's first temple of Radha Krishna, and he wanted David's cooperation. Although the neighborhood was one of the most miserable in the world, Prabhupada talked of bringing deities from Jaipur or Vrindavan and starting temple worship, even on the Bowery. He thought David might help. After all, they were roommates. so there could be no question of David's not cooperating, but he would have to give up his bad habits. Prabhupada was trying to help David, but David was too disturbed. He was headed for disaster, and so were Prabhupada's plans for the loft. Sometimes, even not under the influence of a drug, he would pace around the loft. Other times he appeared to be deep in thought. One day, on a dose of LSD, he went completely crazy. As Carl Jurgens put it, he just flipped out, and the Swami had to deal with a crazy man. Things had been leading to this. He was a crazy kid who always took too much. But the real madness happened suddenly. Swamiji was working peacefully at his typewriter when David, quote unquote, freaked out. David started moaning and pacing around the large open area of the loft. Then he began yelling, howling, and running all around. He went back to where the Swami was. Suddenly Prabhupada found himself face to face, not with David, nice David, whom he was going to take to India to show the Brahmins in Vrindavan, but a drugged, wild-eyed stranger, a madman. Prabhupada tried to speak to him. What is the matter? But David had nothing to say. There was no particular disagreement, just madness. Yeah, these drugs, they're such destroyers. Really, nobody ever got helped or really made progress by taking these drugs. It just destroyed their piety, destroyed their intelligence, their culture, their character. And that's what happened to this crazy fellow. Prabhupada moved quickly down the 4 flights of stairs. He had not stopped to gather up any of his belongings, or even to decide where he would go, or whether he would return. There had been no time to consider anything. He had taken quite a shock, and now he was leaving the arena of David's madness. The usual group of bums were sitting in the doorway, and with their customary flourish of courtesy, they allowed him to pass. They were used to the elderly swamis coming in and out, going shopping and returning, and they didn't bother him. But he was not going shopping today. Where was he going? He didn't know. He had come onto the street without knowing where he would go. He wasn't going back to the loft, that was for sure. But where could he go? The pigeons flew from roof to roof. Traffic rumbled, and the ever-present bums loitered about, getting drunker on cheap, poisonous alcohol. Although Prabhupada's home had suddenly become an insane terror, the street at its door was also a hellish, dangerous place. He was shaken. He could call Dr. Mishra's, and they might take him in. But that chapter of his life was over, and he'd gone on to something better. He had his own classes, young people chanting and hearing. Was it all over now? After 9 months in America, he'd finally gotten a good response to his preaching in kirtan. He couldn't just quit now. A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Maharaj, whom everyone knew and respected in Vrindavan as a distinguished scholar and devotee, who had an open invitation to see the Vice President of India and many other notables, now had to face starkly that he had not one friend of stature in the United States. Suddenly, he was as homeless as any derelict on the street. In fact, many of them, with their long-time berths in flop houses, were more secure than he. They were ruined, but settled. The Bowery could be a chaotic hell if you weren't on a very purposeful errand going directly to a store or back to your place. It was no place to stand wondering, where will you live, or is there a friend you can turn to? He wasn't on his way to Chinatown to stop, nor was he taking a little stroll, soon to return to the shelter of the loft. If he couldn't go to the loft, he had no place. How difficult it was becoming to preach in America amid these crazy people. He had written prophetically in his poem the day he had arrived in Boston Harbor, quote, "My dear Lord, I do not know why you've brought me here. Now you can do with me whatever you like. But I guess you have some business here. Otherwise, why would you bring me to this terrible place?" Unquote. What about his scheduled classes? What about David? Should he go back and try and talk with the boy? This had been David's first fit of violence, but there had been other tense moments. David had a habit of leaving the soap on the floor of the shower stall. And Prabhupada had asked him not to because it was a habit, because it was a hazard. But David wouldn't listen. Prabhupada had continued to remind him, and one day David had gotten angry and shouted at him. But there was no real enmity. Even today's incident had not been a matter of personal differences. The boy was a victim. Prabhupada walked quickly. He had free passage on the Scindia line. He could go home to Vrindavan. But his spiritual master had ordered him to come here, quote, by the strong desire of Sri Srimad Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur, unquote. He had written while crossing the Atlantic, quote, "The holy name of Lord Gauranga will spread throughout all the countries of the Western world," unquote. Before nightfall, he would have to find some place to stay, a way to keep up the momentum of his preaching. This is what it meant to be working without government sponsorship, without the support of any religious organization, without a patron. It meant being vulnerable and insecure. Prabhupada faced the crisis as a test from Krishna. The instruction of Bhagavad Gita was to depend on Krishna for protection. Quote, "In all activities, just depend on me and work always under my protection. In such devotional service, be fully conscious of me. You will pass over all the obstacles of conditional life by my grace," unquote. He decided to phone Carl Jurgens and ask him to help. Hearing the Swami's voice on the phone, it was an emergency. Carl at once agreed that Prabhupada could move in with him and his wife, Eva. Their place was close by on Center Street, 5 blocks west of Bowery, near Chinatown. Carl would be right over. After Carl found Prabhupada, they went straight to Carl's place, an AIR loft, smaller than the one Prabhupada had been living in. It had a main living area, large and open, with areas for the kitchen and bedroom partitioned off. There were decorative indoor plants and a profusion of throw pillows placed all around. Carl's loft was much brighter than the dingy, factory-like space in the loft on the Bowery. The floor was painted bright orange. Carl used to say it looked like the deck of a ship. The walls and ceiling were white, and light from 7 skylights filled the room. Carl and Eva settled the Swami in one corner. Prabhupada had left his belongings at David's loft and didn't want to go back. So Carl went over to pick up a few essential items. Prabhupada asked him to leave most of his things, including his books, suitcases, and reel-to-reel tape recorder where they were. Although by this time David had come down from the intense effects of the LSD, he remained crazy. When Carl arrived at the loft, the door was locked and David was inside, afraid to let anyone in, although finally he relented. He had shut and locked all the windows, making the loft oppressively hot and stuffy. Bill Epstein, who also came by that day, analyzed David as having had, quote unquote, a drug-induced nervous breakdown, a narcopsychosis, unquote. And although David was sorry he had exploded at the Swami, neither Bill nor Carl thought Prabhupada should live with David again. Apparently, Prabhupada's chances of making the loft into a Radha Krishna temple were finished. Carl and Bill gathered up a few of the Swami's belongings, and David stayed behind in the loft. He wanted to be alone. Carl Jürgens knew Prabhupada's living habits and wanted to accommodate him with a suitable place to live and work. In a small alcove at one end of his loft, Carl had a small study which he allocated for the Swami. Carl also set up a cushioned dais and arranged the living room around it so that guests could sit on the floor in a semicircle. Carl's wife, who didn't really like the idea of a Swami moving in, agreed to cover a few cushions with Indian madras material for him anyway. Things went smoothly for a while. Prabhupada continued his morning and evening classes, and many of the Bowery hip crowd came by. 3 of his regular callers lived right in the same building, and a few others, including Carl's brother, were just around the block. Michael Grant, James Green, who became Yogeshwar, I think. Even David Allen came once. Don Nathanson, an artist. I was at Carl's loft, and the Swami comes strolling in one day. So I already knew he was on the scene from David's. Mostly musicians were coming. They were enjoying the private morning session with him. And that's really strange in itself, because these people were up almost all night. And he used to do it at 6 a.m. for 1 hour. He would lead them in chanting with his hand symbols, ... da. It was strange, because that crowd was heavy into drugs, and they were well read. But for a short period, they used to go every morning, 9 or 10 of them, and they felt very good about it. They felt very good that they did that in the morning. Carl felt that the creative group who came to see the Swami in his studio were all quick to enter into the mood of the kirtan, but they were using it in their own ways to supplement their own private visions and ecstasies, with no real intention of adopting the disciplines or the undivided worship of Lord Krishna. Prabhupada was their first real contact with a spiritual person, and yet without trying to understand, they became absorbed in his kirtans and in what he had to say. Oops. Carl would invite them. Hey, come on. This is genuine. This is real. You'll like it. It's music. It's dance. It's celebration. Carl saw that, quote, people just felt good being in the Swami's presence and meditating on the chanting and eating the Swami's cooking. It was unlike anything they had experienced before, except maybe for their moments of creative insight, unquote. Yet, for Carl and Eva, Prabhupada's simple presence created difficulty. Never before during his whole stay in America had he been a more inconvenient or unwanted guest. Carl's studio was arranged for him and his wife to live in alone, using the bedroom, kitchen, and living room any way they liked. If they wanted to smoke marijuana or eat meat or whatever, that was their prerogative. This was Carl's home. He lived here with his wife Eva and their dogs and cats. But now they had to share it with the Swami. Almost at once, the situation became intolerable for Eva. She resented the Swami's presence in her home. She was a feminist, a liberated white woman with a black husband and a good job. She didn't like the Swami's views on women. She hadn't read his books or attended his classes, but he had heard that she was opposed to sexual intercourse except for conceiving children, and that in his view a woman was supposed to be shy and chaste and help her husband in spiritual life. She knew about the Swami's four rules: no meat-eating, illicit sex, intoxication, or gambling, and she definitely did not want Carl's Swami trying to change their ways to suit his. And he had better not expect her to wait on him as his servant. She sensed the Swami objecting to almost everything she did. If she were to seek his advice, he would probably ask her to stop taking drugs, get rid of the cats and dogs, stop drinking, and stop contraceptive sex. If the Swami had his way, they would probably eat only at certain times and only certain foods. Eva was a heavy smoker, so he probably wouldn't like being around her. She was ready for a confrontation. But Prabhupada was not one to make intolerant demands while living in another's home. He kept to his allotted corner of the loft, and he made no demands or criticisms. Hadn't he seen his host and butler eating meat, and only remarked, "Think nothing of it"? Nevertheless, his imposing spiritual presence made Eva sorry Carl had ever met him. To Eva, the Swami was an inimical force, and she, being candid and independent, let him know. As soon as he asked whether she could bring him something, she replied, "Get it yourself." Carol Becker saw the situation as being extremely uncomfortable and tense. Eva, she said, Eva was quite resentful. Eva complained to Carol. Here she was paying rent for the loft, working hard, and this man was trying to change their way of life. Carol. Eva couldn't handle his teachings, and she couldn't handle his influence over Carl. She didn't feel so constrained, but she felt that Swamiji was making Carl feel constrained, unquote. This was Eva's main objection. The Swami was influencing Carl. Her relationship with Carl had only recently begun, and Carl was aware that she needed much of his time. He agreed with his wife, yet he couldn't refuse the Swami. He was interested in Indian music, poetry, and religions, and here was a living authority, vastly knowledgeable in all facets of Indian culture, right in his home. Prabhupada would cook his meals in their kitchen, and right away Carl would be there, eager to learn the art of Indian cuisine. Carl also wanted the Swami to show him how to play the drum. They would have long talks together. Carol was trying to be something he really wasn't, but he would never have suggested that the Swami had to leave. Swami, I'm sure, was astute enough to pick up on this tension. As soon as he could, he tried to move to another place. Gradually, Carl reached an impasse in his relationship with Prabhupada. He couldn't share his life with both his wife and the Swami, and ultimately he was more inclined toward his wife. Carl, I couldn't see my loft becoming a temple. I was raising cats and dogs, and he wanted them removed. He used to call me a meat eater, but then he changed our diet. Of course, he was hitting the American culture, which doesn't know what all this business is. I have to put it on myself as much as anyone. I could understand and absorb India through an impersonal agency like a book or a record, but here was the living representative of Godhead. And to me, it was as difficult as anything I've ever had to do before or since. Unquote. Prabhupada was not insensitive to the distress his presence was causing. He didn't want to inconvenience anyone. And of course, he could have avoided all inconvenience, both for himself and for people like Eva, if he had never come to America. But he wasn't concerned with convenience or inconvenience, pleasing Eva or displeasing her. He wanted to teach Krishna consciousness. Prabhupada had a mission, and Carl's loft didn't seem to be the right base for it. Prabhupada's friends all agreed he should move more into the center of things. The Bowery and Chinatown were too far out of the way. They would find him a new place. Forced by conditions he accepted as Krishna's mercy, Prabhupada sat patiently, trying not to disturb anyone, yet speaking about Krishna consciousness day and night. Carl assured him that with half a dozen people searching, it wouldn't take long to find a new place, and they would all chip in together and help him with the rent. Hare Krishna. Srila Prabhupada ki jai.
You tend to appreciate Prabhupada much more after listening to
Oh, yeah.